Welcome. Can you see us all properly?
I can see you.
Professor Jordan Schonig. Schonig, that you pronounce like a...
Yeah, that sounds great.
So Jordan is professor at the Texas Christian University, Fort Worth, at the area of film and media studies. He has recently published a book in Oxford University Press titled The Shape of Motion. So I give the word to you now.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Vitor, for having me in your class. This is a really cool opportunity for me. Let me try to share my screen before I proceed. And I want to make sure you guys can see this right. Let's see if I go to... All right, can you see my first slide? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks again for having me. Today, I'm going to talk about some elements of film theory, especially what's known as realist film theory. And then I'm going to kind of transition into an example of a chapter from my book, which is about cinematic motion and its relationship to film theory. I do want to kind of just acknowledge that I am not a philosopher. I'm not trained in analytic philosophy. I'm interested in it, as Vitor can attest, but I'm not going to be invoking a lot of concepts from the traditions of analytic aesthetics in this talk, but I think a lot of the things that I'm saying are adjacent to it. And so I'm curious to hear what everyone has to say. I want to make sure that I can time myself so I know where I'm at. Okay, so I'm calling this Realist Film Theory, Photographic Indexicality, and the Wind in the Trees. This lecture is going to happen in two parts. The first is going to be a little bit of background on what I'm calling realist film theory and photographic indexicality. And the second part is going to be a case study in the ways in which traditions of realist film theory have kind of influenced particular myths that film historians kind of are interested in. And that myth that I'm interested in is called the wind in the trees. I'm going to presume a kind of lack of knowledge of some basic tenets of film studies. And so bear with me if you're familiar with some of the things that I'm going to go through, but just for the sake of the exercise, I'm going to go through some what I think are canonical and simplified understandings of some tenets of film theory. So the first thing that I want to talk about are what's known as kind of two tendencies in classical film theory. And when I say film theory, I mean the kind of body of knowledge production that's interested in, say, defining the essence of film as a medium. After 1968, film theory kind of took a political turn, but between the 19-teens and 1960s, film theorists were interested in a kind of aesthetic philosophy of film. Like, what is the essence of film? What does it mean to produce cinematic meaning? How is film distinct from the other arts? The kind of questions that I think are consistent with the aesthetics of, or the philosophy of aesthetics. One major tendency or polarity in classical film theory is between what's known as formalism and realism. Those terms don't mean the same thing that they mean in aesthetic philosophy. They're rather kind of broad names for general tendencies. And so I'd like to simplify these two tendencies in this particular way. So a formalist film theorist is going to say something like this, that because photographic cinema has deep ties to material reality, because of course, photographs as a medium have this connection to the material world, the essence of cinema and its status as a unique artistic medium lies in its ability to overcome or transcend its ties to reality. The realist film theorist, a kind of thinker that would largely emerge in the mid-century, is going to start from a similar premise, but make an almost opposite kind of claim. Because photographic cinema has deep ties to material reality, we might say, the essence of cinema and its status as a unique artistic medium lies in its ability to represent, capture, or express something of reality. Both positions take it as a premise that film has this unique connection to the material reality because it's presumed that when we talk about film, we're talking about photographic films, not cartoons. And so I'm going to give you a brief representation of these two positions with, I think, two of the most representative of these positions. The first is the person on your left, Rudolf Arnheim. Now, Rudolf Arnheim is a psychologist and philosopher of art, but he also has one of the most important books on film from the 1930s. It's called Film as Art. And the argument begins this way. It says, it is worthwhile to refute thoroughly and systematically the charge that photography and film are only mechanical reproductions and that they therefore have no connection with art. For this is an excellent method of getting to understand the nature of film art. So what I want you to understand about this position is that film theorists from the 19-teens, 20s, and early 30s took it as a premise that they needed to defend the legitimacy of the medium because they were responding to claims that film, because it's too close to reality, is not art. It's in other words, it's merely nature. It's not imposing something creative and new upon the world. Some people said it was merely canned theater. Like, we already have this medium of theater in which you have stage actors performing a fictional scenario. Film is simply taking that and putting it on a screen. It's not doing anything different. Arnheim is responding to that kind of accusation. And he continues, he says, with this in view, the basic elements of film, the film medium, will be examined separately and compared with the corresponding characteristics of what we perceive in reality. It will be seen how fundamentally different the two kinds of image are, and that it is just these differences that provide film with its artistic resources. So in other words, Arnheim says, the accusers say that film is too much like reality. Therefore, I will locate the artistic uniqueness of film as a medium in all the ways in which the moving image is distinct from human perception. So consider that we're at a train station on the right, and consider a moving image of the train station. This is a famous moving image from the Lumiere brothers, who are usually attributed with the first projected moving images in 1895 in France. And Arnheim would catalog the ways in which, just as an image, this is distinct from, say, being there with your own two eyes. So in the 19-teens and 20s, moving images were soundless, they were colorless, they were two-dimensional, they were framed. They had a shared point of view. So if a number of us were at the same train station, we would all occupy a different point of view upon the train. Similarly, if we were at a stage play, we would all have a slightly different viewpoint upon the action of the stage. What cinema does is it forces us to share the same point of view on the same action. So film is at once an image and also a very lifelike picture of the world, as if it's like you're there in real life. It's the fusion of the two. And finally, Arnheim would acknowledge the degree to which montage, cutting and being able to jump from different space to space and from different time to time, is also, in an obvious way, transcending what a human perception of a real situation would do. And so that is kind of Arnheim's rhetorical strategy. But a couple decades later, in 1945, you start to get theorists who are interested in responding to this formalist tendency. One of the biggest theorists is André Bazin. André Bazin is probably known as the most canonical thinker of cinematic realism in the history of film thought. He was a film critic at the famous French film magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, one of the founding members. He wrote many thousands of articles of film criticism, but he also wrote works of film theory. He was interested in the medium as much as he was interested in films. But his favorite films were those that are in film studies known as like the canon of realist film, stuff like Italian neorealism from the 1940s, and stuff like Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, which is known for these deep focus compositions that Bazin was really interested in. Most of film studies thinks that all of Bazin's thought, his interest in the reality of film, can be tied to this single essay from 1945 called The Ontology of the Photographic Image, which is not so much an essay about individual films as it is an essay about the nature of a photographic image as distinct from, say, a painted image. So notice how on the left, Arnheim will say something like, we need to refute thoroughly and systematically the charge that photography and film are only mechanical reproductions. But check out what Bazin says, not exactly in response, because I don't think he thought of himself as responding to Arnheim, but notice how he invokes the same term, mechanical reproduction, but gives it a very different valence. He says, photography completely satisfies our appetite for illusion by means of a process of mechanical reproduction in which there is no human agency at work. His essay is interested in the fact that movies and photographs have their basis in mechanical reproduction. He thinks that's interesting and that it's an intervention in the history of images, and we have to take that seriously. And of course, when he says mechanical reproduction of photographs, he's thinking about the process of how photographs are made. He doesn't detail this in his essay, but it's clear that when he's saying this, he's assuming that his audience understands that a photograph is the result in some way, not only of human choices, but more importantly for him, a kind of relationship between light and a photochemical surface that receives light, right? As much as you might choose the things that go into a photograph, Bazin is interested in the ways in which the photograph seems to be produced automatically or mechanically because light is also the author of the image. And he'll come up with ways to articulate exactly what he means to say is the relationship between an object and the photograph of that object. So he'll say this. He'll say the most faithful drawing can give us more information about the model, the thing being photographed, but it will never possess the irrational power of photography in which we believe without reservation. So these kinds of articulations in which he will posit a distinction between resemblance and this other thing that photographs have are really important. So imagine we have this apple, and we have a photograph of the apple on the left, and we have a painting of the apple on the right. Notice that the photograph on the left is fuzzy and it's black and white, two qualities that would reduce the resemblance value of the photograph. The painting on the right has more verisimilitude. It's sharper, the color values are more accurate. Bazin is interested in all the ways in which the photograph of the apple, he says, contains something of the reality or the quote unquote ontology of the apple. And throughout the essay, he'll struggle to explain what he means by that. But because he's not a philosopher, he's a French thinker and he's an aesthete, he'll try to describe this in terms of metaphor. And one of the metaphors he uses that has like the most lasting impression on film studies is something like this, where he says the existence of the photographed object, that apple, shares in the existence of the apple itself, of the model, like a fingerprint. So this is kind of one of the simplest and most long-lasting metaphors that he uses, because if a photograph is like a fingerprint, some film studies scholars said, aha, now I know what Bazin means in his mysterious essay. What he really means, film studies scholars said, is that he means that photographs are indexes or indices of the objects that they represent. And a very influential piece of scholarship by Peter Wolin basically canonized the reading of Bazin in this way. He said that when Bazin is struggling to discuss photography, what he's really doing is unwittingly invoking Charles Sanders Peirce's notion of the index. So Peirce is this pragmatist philosopher who has three categories of signs: icon, symbol, and index. And I'll talk about icon and symbol as a way just to distinguish what's special about the index. So an icon is a kind of sign that has a physical resemblance to the thing being represented, like a figurative painting, right? So if a sign is anything that conjures to the mind something that isn't there, an iconic sign is something that conjures to the mind something that isn't there by resembling it. So this painting of a tree makes me think of a tree. A symbolic sign is a sign that has no resemblance to the thing being represented. The connection between them must be culturally learned, like words. So this squiggle, these series of squiggles on the screen that we recognize as the word tree does in fact invoke or call to mind a tree, but it does not resemble a tree in any way. Neither does my spoken sign, tree. Index is the special one. So for Peirce, an index is a sign that shows evidence for the existence of what it refers to, often through some kind of material or causal relation. So a footprint, a weather vane, and a bullet hole are all indexical signs. So look at this footprint. The footprint does indeed resemble a foot, but importantly, it also indexes the existence of a foot that was there in the past. Because we believe when we see the footprint that a foot imprinted itself, materially caused the sign to exist, and in doing so, caused a little sliver of its own existence that we can pick up. And the theory is that when Bazin is talking about photographs, what he's really trying to say is that photographs don't just look like the things they represent, they also index the existence of the things they represent. So these are photographs of trees. And so when I look at them, I am brought to mind with the existence of the tree that was there in the past. And in the same way, any kind of photographic film, regardless of its status as a documentary or a fiction, is always indexing the existence of things in the past. Like this train was actually there in 1895, and these people moved in these particular ways at that sliver of space-time in 1895. And so their existence is indexed. And so even though all photographic signs have this tendency to have high iconic value, they are also indexical. And that was the thing that Bazin was interested in. And so the reading of Bazin and the reading of realist film theory was so obsessed with this idea of index. And so as Daniel Morgan, a film scholar, kind of summarizes, he says, two propositions lie at the heart of this common reading of Bazin. First, Bazin argues for a necessary and determinate relation between the ontology of the photographic image and the realism of film. Second, Bazin gives an account of the ontology of the photographic image that is best understood in terms of a commitment via the mechanical nature of the recording process of the camera to the reproduction of an antecedent reality. In other words, despite the variety and the richness of Bazin's writing, there was a tendency to kind of think of his ideas as coming back to this idea that a film is always giving us a material piece of evidence of the existence of the things in front of it. And therefore, we always think about cinema as having this connection. So I want us to keep this in mind, because now I want to look at a particular strange phenomenon in the history of film that people, I think, have wrongly invoked the idea of indexicality to explain. That's why I'm proceeding to this thing. So this phenomenon, this event that I want to talk about is called the wind in the trees of early cinema. So film studies is sort of obsessed with its own myths. The kind of these stories of how the first spectators reacted to films are part historical account, part theory, because they try to explain, or they have the function of explaining the essence of the medium. So probably the most famous myth of early cinema spectatorship in film studies is attached to this film on the left, The Train at the Station. You might be familiar with this. When in 1895, the first spectators were viewing a movie for the first time, and this train was kind of going along the z-axis of the image, people reportedly freaked out, fainted, kind of imagined the train was going to burst through the screen and run over them. And so they reacted as if they were naive spectators, thinking that the image was reality. So that's myth number one. Myth number two, less famous, but equally important for film studies, is called the wind in the trees. And it's attached to this image on the right. So I want to play you this image. This image that we're looking at here is also from that same collection of 60-second short films projected in front of a cafe in France in 1895. It was part of the same collection that you saw the train film. And this film is called Baby's Breakfast, or Baby's Meal. And clearly it's a staged slice of life in which you have a baby and her two parents. One of them is in fact the author of the film, one of the Lumiere brothers. The important thing to know about this film in the history of film studies, film history, and film theory is that when spectators reportedly watched this film, there were a number of accounts of folks being fascinated not with the baby or with the two parents, but with the wind in the trees in the background. They were fixated on this particular phenomenon. And this has been written about in film studies for a long time. So for example, Marianne Doan, a film scholar, says the anecdote detailing Georges Méliès's fascination, Méliès being one of the first major early filmmakers, his fascination with the moving leaves in the background of the baby's breakfast, rather than with the concerted and centered efforts of the parents to feed the child, is well known. Number two, a book on cinephilia, also called The Wind in the Trees, cites the same ubiquity of this myth. Indeed, as the story goes, many viewers of a century ago who watched the first films of the Lumiere brothers were often delighted less by the scenes being staged for their amusement than by the fact that in the background, the leaves were fluttering in the wind. Now, someone like Divan, another film scholar, will acknowledge the ways in which when we say wind in the trees in film studies, we do mean that particular film and that particular natural phenomenon, but it's also known that there were these other kind of specific detailed movements that spectators were also fascinated on. And when we say wind in the trees, we often kind of implicitly invoke a collection of natural phenomena. So Divan summarizes this well. He says, we need look no further than Sadoul's standard Histoire Générale, which is a famous history of early cinema, for ample evidence of the fact that what most impressed the early audiences were what would now be considered the incidentals of scenes: smoke from a forge, steam from a locomotive, brick dust from a demolished wall. Georges Méliès made particular mention of the rustling of leaves in the background of Baby's Breakfast. So I just want to say that there's a family of phenomena that attracted early spectators And my interest is in why. I've always been fascinated with this. I'm not sure if this is a myth that folks in the room know, or if it seems like a puzzle. But film studies has its own answer to this question, and I've never been satisfied with it. And I'll try to give you a basic summary of what that answer looks like. So the standard film studies answer as to why spectators were fascinated with these little phenomena is usually tied up with this term cinematic contingency. And it's the idea that cinema as a photographic medium has this unique quality that it captures not only the things that the director places in front of the camera, but inevitably captures things that were not placed there by the camera, because the camera indiscriminately records reality, and sometimes the world just happens independently of authorial control. It's not a painting and it's not a cartoon. Sometimes the world happens, like with weather, or a dog will walk on the screen. You just can't control everything. So Marianne Doan kind of summarizes this point nicely. She says, the imprint of the real was automatically guaranteed by the known capability of the machine, the camera. For the first time, an aesthetic representation, previously chained the idea of human control, could be made by accident. So whenever we talk about accident in the history of film, we're always talking about the nature of photographic and cinematographic images. And I think this is the logic of how this idea of contingency and indexicality can sort of explain why spectators were fascinated with the wind in the trees. This is how I kind of break down the logic as it's given by these other thinkers. So first, the breakfast in the foreground in this film is planned, but the wind in the trees in the background is not planned, right? Like clearly it's not of the same kind of thing. Number two, it's the camera that captures the wind in the trees, not the artist. So if the artist is making this film and making choices, there's part of the film that's not being chosen, and the world is sort of imposing it on the image. The wind in the trees thus testifies to the new medium's ability to capture or index the world independently of the artist's control. Spectators are attracted to that which showcases the novelty of the medium. Thus, they're interested in the wind in the trees, not the breakfast. So if the wind in the trees testifies to the nature of the medium's ability to capture what exists beyond the control of the artist, and for the first time, film is the medium that actually puts the things that you don't intend onto the image, naturally, these authors suggest, spectators will be fixated on the thing that is new, the thing that is not controlled. So I have some problems with this, and this is the nature of the argument that I want to make. The first observation and the most central observation that I want to make about why I have a problem with this, and this is sort of a phenomenological insight. So you'll have to like measure whether you see the similarity or not. Is that I think that recently, in the last 15 years, we've seen similar reactions to similar kind of phenomena in films that are not photographed but animated. Especially CG cartoons like Brave or Frozen or Piper. Take any Pixar film and look at some reactions from the last 15 years. And I'll give you just an example of what I mean. So what hasn't changed, this is a film critic, what hasn't changed is Pixar's technical mastery and the hair alone worth the price of admission. When Pixar's Brave came out, there was a big hoopla about the hair of the protagonist being hyper-realistic and therefore mesmerizing and interesting to look at. This is a sliver from a critic on WALL-E. Bob Mandela says, "WALL-E's world, in all its epic decay, looks real. You can almost taste the dust." So I'm interested in the idea that the critic says the film looks real and then intuitively cites a particular phenomenon as a testament to that realism, and it happens to be dust, the same kind of thing that the early spectators were interested in. This is also all over the internet. So if you look at, say, videos made by CG artists that kind of demonstrate the algorithms they use to simulate natural phenomena in these films. So in Frozen, there is this video put out to demonstrate the very complex algorithms that the team developed in order to create snow. And some of the comments on YouTube are indeed from other animators who are interested in the technical aspect, but there are always these responses that are purely about being mesmerized by the perceptual fidelity of these things. So, oh my God, it's so natural, amazing job. And these invocations of awe, I think, are everywhere, though I suspect, and we can talk about this later, I suspect that they're starting to wane a bit in the last, say, 5 years. But in any case, they've been recorded in history. So my question is, how can a fascination with the unplanned, the contingent, manifest itself in an image so meticulously calculated, right? So if the explanation as to why early spectators were interested in the dust was because it's a testament to the dust's, say, contingent existence, how can a seemingly similar fascination happen with an image that is not photographed, but is absolutely planned with every single detail, right? This is an animation, this is a painting, this is not a photographed image on the bottom. So here's my response, and this is largely what I want to say. The wind in the trees is not appealing because it indexes an unplanned or contingent event, but because it depicts complex or contingent motion with such precision. So this is sort of a specific kind of distinction that I'm making between two different manners in which something can be contingent or unplanned. And so here's how I cash this out. I like to think of it in terms of an unplanned event versus unplannable motion. And as Vitor mentioned, my interest in the book from which this chapter emerges is about motion. I'm interested in motion and the specificity of particular kinds of motion. So for example, if we were looking at this early film, also by the Lumiere brothers, called Workers Leaving a Factory, and if you're a cinephile and you notice, say, at this moment, there's a stray dog or somebody's dog that wanders into the frame, there it is. It looks to the right and suddenly leaves. And you might say, the moment when the dog enters the frame is pure cinema. You might be invoking the logic of photographic indexicality. You might be noticing the distinction between the staged event, the idea that workers are leaving the factory, and I'm rolling the camera to record that. But because the world happens independently of my control, the dog happened to walk into the screen, and my noticing it is testifying to the uniqueness that this is a photographed image. That makes sense to me. And I think that is the logic of photographic indexicality. In the same way, if we look at the baby's breakfast film again, but this time I want you to pay attention to what the baby does in this wonderful moment. The baby is holding a cracker, and that there's actually a moment here where it seems as if the baby is noticing the camera person like next to the camera, perhaps Lumiere's brother, her uncle, and she gestures at, seems to offer the cracker to the moment. If you fixate on that moment and you say, this is pure cinema, you're invoking the idea that cinema does indeed capture the things that exceed the control or the planning of the artist/director. Right. And I think that does testify to this thing that we're calling photographic indexicality. And indeed in the history of film theorists who have a realist bent love babies and animals, because babies and animals, the idea goes, have less of a consciousness of the camera. And so when they behave on screen, it's almost like we're getting something closer to reality than the adult person who changes their behavior when they're filmed. And I think that is a real thing. What I think, though, is that that's a different thing from why spectators were fascinated with the wind in the trees. Because when we see rippling waves or swirling dust or rippling leaves, swirling dust or waves, not as unplanned events, but I think we see them as unplannable motion, seemingly impossible to design, predict, or reproduce. In other words, take the film in the middle, which is called The Demolition of the Wall, also by the Lumiere brothers. When the dust emerges, it is not as if I am surprised that the dust emerged. The film has a very predictable trajectory. There's a group of men are demolishing a wall. I see the wall about to fall, and when it does, dust emerges. So it's not right to say, I think, that the dust is an aspect of film that is contingent. Rather, it's the way the dust moves. If I look at every little pixel, or rather every little grain, I can't quite predict the way in which the trajectories of dust particles will move, because their complexity exceeds the way in which I perceive the world as a series of likely predictable actions. In other words, these forms of motion are the opposite of the proverbial billiard ball table, where I can predict how the balls will affect the balls on the table because they correspond to how I think about physics. These are natural phenomena that do behave according to physical principles, but the physical principles are very complex, that they feel unpredictable to me. And I feel like that same idea applies equally to CG cartoons and CG images more generally as it does to photographic images. Because when we look at these images, I want to say we're also looking at unplannable motion, seemingly impossible to design, predict, and reproduce. And that's why I find them awe-inspiring to look at, or amazing, mesmerizing to look at. So when I say I'm moving from the logic of unplanned event to unplannable motion, I'm moving from a theory that emphasizes the indexical qualities of film kind of to a theory that emphasizes the iconic qualities of film, or what we might call the resemblance qualities of film, or the verisimilitudinousness, the fact that films look a lot like the things that they resemble, which is equally true of CG as it is of photography. Not to the same degree, but I believe that when we're mesmerized by CG images, we are mesmerized by their fidelity. So, but I haven't quite explained what makes these phenomena attractive on screen. Because in a way, thinkers, artists, philosophers have for a long time talked about these phenomena as interesting to behold. Da Vinci was fascinated with the movements of water. The philosopher Gilles Deleuze writes a lot about the interestingness of water as it appears. Lucretius is interested in these things. There's a long tradition of thinkers being fascinated with these kinds of phenomena. So why is it that these phenomena are interesting to behold when they're pictured on screen? So to answer this question, I turn to a strange passage from the Critique of Judgment from Kant. So Kant has this interesting passage where he kind of argues that fire and water are disqualified from being objects of beauty, which is strange because one of the hallmarks of Kant's account of beauty is that it doesn't seem to be based on any set of criteria. It seems like a very free thing that can happen to all kinds of objects. So let me read this passage and explain. He calls this beautiful views versus beautiful objects. He says, we must distinguish between beautiful objects. We must distinguish beautiful objects from beautiful views of objects. In beautiful views of objects, taste seems to fasten not so much on what the imagination apprehends in that area as on the actual fantasies with which the mind entertains itself as it is continually being aroused by the diversity that strikes the eye. This is similar, he says, to what happens when we watch the changing shapes of the flames in a fireplace or of a rippling brook. Neither of these are beauties, but they still charm the imagination because they sustain its free play. So to clarify, because it's a difficult passage, I want to draw on a reading of this passage from Claudia Brodsky, who says, the eye finds itself mentally immobilized by a continuous movement of forms in the beholding of fire and water, an unbroken and non-progressive motion which, even while it is being perceived, affords the mind no single point or moment of empirical reference. So what she's explaining is basically that fire and water have too much protean shape-shifting movement for us to behold them as static bounded entities. And to explain further, here's how I kind of break down this logic. So fire and water are excluded from judgments of beauty because they defy what Kant takes to be our natural faculty for grasping objects as static bounded entities. Like I can perceive this water bottle as a static bounded entity. And when I behold it as beautiful, I imagine that you are beholding the same object, even though you're sitting 2 feet away from me. Secondly, the shape-shifting movements of fire and water attract us because they kind of stimulate all of these different images in our mind at a rapid rate, but they render those objects perceptually unshareable. This unshareability denies the possibility of subjective universality, the conviction that others ought to find the same object beautiful. In other words, fire and water, and by extension, I would hope that you'd accept other similar phenomena, are changing their shape so quickly and in such a wild fashion that I can't be convinced that we're actually looking at the same thing. Therefore, I can only find it charming. I can't find it beautiful because I can't ascertain that we are in fact beholding the same object. And for judgment of beauty to be a judgment of beauty for Kant, I need to feel the conviction that you find it beautiful too. And so I need to feel as if you're seeing the same thing. So if you accept this line of reasoning, you don't have to believe it, but I just want you to see, like, what is it about fire and water that's motivating Kant to say this? I want to use this as a launching point to answer the question, how does the moving image, both photographic and computer generated, affect these unshareable views of water, fire, smoke, and leaves? In other words, if long before cinema was invented, Kant and other thinkers have thought that these kinds of phenomena were interesting to behold, even impossible to kind of lock down and grasp, what does it mean that in 1895, when we had the first moving images, one of the first kinds of objects in moving images that spectators were interested in were these very kinds of images? How do we explain that? Well, what I want to say is that the moving image, both photographic and computer generated, makes beautiful views, the kind of crazy, contingent, chaotic movements of fire, water, leaves, smoke, perceptually shareable for the first time in history. So what do I mean by perceptually shareable? Here's what I mean. I mean that beautiful views of contingent motion are made shareable, and thus, in a way, available for aesthetic judgment, because moving images are spatially and temporally inscribed. I think this is just a weird way of describing something that is basic to kind of all images, but moving images in particular. So a moving image is spatially inscribed because we share one singular point of view on an object, right? So even though if we're sitting around a campfire, we're all looking at the fire from a different angle, but when I show you a film of the fire, we all have the privilege of sharing the same point of view on something that looks very similar to how it would look to us in reality. Moving images are also temporally inscribed because they make the unpredictable movements of these phenomena perfectly repeatable. And it's actually really important that in 1895 to around 1905, there were these short films, the kinds of films that the Lumieres would show, that would actually be playing on loop. Like, we don't play 2-hour movies on loop because that's just not our convention of spectatorship. But when the films were 60 seconds long, they would play on loop. And so you would see these natural movements kind of miraculously repeated in all the precise and complex ways that they were pinned down by the image. So I want to say that this is equally the case of CGI images, just because CGI images are also moving images. And it might help explain what it is that moving images do to the history of perceiving the natural world in motion. And I want to make clear that in making this observation, I'm kind of doing something similar to what Arnheim is doing when he's talking about the moving image. He's interested in all the ways that a moving image is distinct from human perception. He's interested in the two-dimensionality. He's interested in the fact that it's framed. He's interested in the fact that we occupy a shared point of view. And I think those things are necessary to understanding what it is that a moving image does to our natural perception of the world, and hopefully explain this strange phenomenon, right? And one of the last things that I want to say before I close is I want to kind of acknowledge, I think, a reasonable objection that one might have, which is that when we look at an image like this, which is from Frozen, and I take it that there's something really impressive, mesmerizing, even about the bubbles, how like accurate they are to the way that bubbles move. And then we realize when we're looking at it that bubbles have this very strange and contingent way of moving, but it's also kind of like we're used to it. So we would notice when it was kind of off, but this particularly looks very, very right. The question might be, don't we find this interesting or mesmerizing because we know that it was difficult to produce? Like, isn't it the case that Disney has always shown off how much labor they put into their images? Like, they actually had a publicity team about Brave, in which they said, we have 150 people working on the hair alone, or we have all these teams working on bubbles and snow and Frozen. And maybe what we're marveling at is not the image, but we're marveling at the virtuosic labor, or maybe the technological sublime. I don't think that's right. I think rather that what's going on here, sorry, I'm trying to, what's going on here is that, in my view, the aesthetic appeal of these simulated bubbles is inextricable from our rediscovery of the physical complexity of actual bubbles. Like, I don't think you need the knowledge of how it's produced to find it mesmerizing. In other words, I think that most of us know that these things in life are mesmerizing. We just don't have the occasion for aesthetic reverie upon them because their existence has become banal. But I think that seeing them rendered in a new kind of moving image triggers our awareness of how perceptually complex it is. And that's what we're looking at. So I want to say that, like, the history of moving images, including CGI and also early cinema, does this thing where it causes spectators to, like, at once realize how the natural world is beautiful and interesting and complex, and also appreciate how the image itself is amazing in its ability to reproduce that complexity on a moving image. So I think there's a phenomenological consistency across 1895 spectators and contemporary spectators looking at CGI. So one question you might ask is, what is the point of this? Like, why does this matter beyond just like reinterpreting this myth in film studies? Well, one thing is just I have an interest in thinking about film theory and how film theory has kind of trapped us into ways of thinking. So film theorists tend to think in terms of essences, that maybe the essence of film is photography, which is how we got to the index. Or conversely, you might say the essence of film is movement. And you might think that that's what I'm interested in, given that my book is all about movement. But in a sense, the thing that I want to say is movement as essence of cinema and photography as essence of cinema are both kind of putting us into a corner. And I'm interested in like forms of motion. So my book is organized into chapters that look at individual genres or forms of motion. And what I've just done is an example of what I call contingent motion, and how thinking in terms of like genres of motion can help us kind of get out of particular stuck places in the history of film theory. So that's my time. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I wanted to ask you on your thoughts on movement. How do you feel about the relevance of kind of unexpected movement when it occurs in human characters in film, as opposed to like nature and more like background movement?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question, because that's the second chapter of my book, actually. My first chapter is on kind of what I just presented, which is about contingent motion. And I want it to be my first chapter because it's one of the old myths of early cinema. My second chapter is what I call habitual gestures, which is all about kind of like looking at human bodies in the same way that early spectators looked at the wind in the trees. Because there is this other discourse and this other history of the moving image kind of catalyzing an attention to the micro movements of bodies. So like, if you look at someone performing a task, your attention will be distributed in particular ways. But the moving image, because it kind of pins down these very specific micro movements of bodies, kind of affords a different kind of attention. And I'm really interested in the kinds of films that can catalyze your attention to what we might call micro movements, right? And so in that particular chapter, I'm interested in a tradition within realist cinema where people will just do mundane tasks for like 45 seconds, and it seems very boring, but like this thing triggers your mind to kind of change your habits of perception, where you start to focus on a body doing tasks. So if anyone knows the film Jean Dielman, it's not a film that I talk about, but Jean Dielman is like this, famous 3.5-hour feminist masterpiece of a film in which you're forced to watch this housewife do chores for like way too long. And it's really, making this kind of statement that it's forcing you to watch things that Hollywood films don't make you watch. But something happens when you become accustomed to a different way of seeing a human body, and you get accustomed to like forms of like virtuosity, that you can see the ways in which a body can be very proficient at doing ordinary tasks, and there's an aesthetic interest in that proficiency. And so I'm sort of interested in like how film as a medium allows us to see these weird aspects of bodily movement that we don't think of as like, say, athletic, or we don't think of as related to narrative or narrative development, but that are related to the fact that we can see the details in the body. And I do talk about how at this level, you can start to see contingencies, like little accidents, like little facial tics that we can't say are planned, but are part of like the holistic thing that we call a performance. And so I'm really interested in that as part of like the general weirdness and uniqueness of film as a medium of movement, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
I was listening to this and thinking about the Muybridge experiments. The idea that there seems to be here the idea that cinema reveals aspects of reality in the way that photography, as opposed to painting. We had those amazing paintings of horses racing, and with photography and with the Muybridge experiments, we really realized that some of those positions that horses were depicted were actually physically impossible, but they were so much more expressive for that, something that is exploited in sculpture and painting. But here this seems to suggest that there's this revelatory mode of cinema opens us up aesthetically, precisely to those aspects. What do you?
Yeah. So revelation and the idea of film as a revelatory medium is something that I do talk about in the book. And I have a kind of disproportionate devotion to theorists who we might call part of that revelationist tradition. So Bazin is often invoked as someone who's interested in film's capacity to reveal. Siegfried Krakauer, the Frankfurt School theorist who has a book on filmic realism, is also associated with this way of thinking. Benjamin has aspects in the work of art essay that are associated with revelation. And actually, a lot of what I talk about in that chapter on the body, on habitual gestures, is very much oriented to this idea that film as a medium can reveal things. One kind of intervention I have with respect to the discourse of revelation, which is a major one, there's a book in film studies by Malcolm Turvey, who's actually kind of close to the analytic tradition, all about the revelationist discourse in film theory. The idea, once again, that film is special because it reveals things to our eyes that our eyes cannot see. The thing that I try to divert myself from is the rhetoric of the idea that film needs to do something unreal to reveal. So for example, that film needs to do slow-mo, or that film needs to do a close-up, or that film needs to demonstrate its capacity to reveal the world in a way that seems demonstrably unlike cinematic human perception. That's a tendency in Turvey's book that I think kind of discounts what films automatically do just by being images. The fact that films like provide us with an image that seems very lifelike, but the fact that it's an image already affords us a way of looking that can feel revelatory. That's something that I try to reiterate in the book, because I don't want to make this claim that it's only with these non-traditional forms of manipulating the image that we get the revelation. I mean, the Muybridge experiment testifies to this, because for Muybridge, right, he was doing this experiment based on a bet, and the bet was, right, that, hey, do you think when a horse is running that all four of its legs are off the ground at the same time? And they just didn't know, because they couldn't pin down the horse when it's running. They could only reveal the truth when they stopped the image. Like, it would be hard to see in a film because a film would be too much like your human perception. And so it was the stopping of the image that would reveal the truth, something which is actually not like our perception. And, Etienne Jules Mouret, who was making chronophotographs at the time, thought, what's the point in reproducing movement? What I want to do is I want to capture movement and still it so we can observe it scientifically, right? And so I kind of want to push against the impulse in film studies, which is to say that film has the capacity to reveal things with these weird manipulations. I want to say that, like, film on its own doesn't need a demonstrably strange or unearthly way of depicting movement. Just the fact of movement being imaged has the capacity to change our way of gleaning knowledge from it. That's how I talk about it in the book.
That's basically saying that you have these two supposedly opposed ways of looking at the phenomenon: for formalism, which puts an emphasis on transcending ties to reality, and realism, capturing and expressing material reality. It's like you're saying this is actually a false dichotomy. There's something of a false dichotomy there, because through formal distortion, you get to aspects of reality you were not previously able to get, just like science does with models. I mean, models in science involves distortion, so that you can capture something you would not do so previously.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I'm very sympathetic to that idea. And anytime I teach a film theory course and I illustrate the formalism versus realism dichotomy, it's a useful dichotomy because I think it illuminates connections across the family of film theorists that we look at in class. And I think it's useful, as I think most dichotomies and concepts that simplify are indeed useful. But anytime you kind of go deep into the theorist, it always feels inadequate. right? So Bazin is a realist, of course, but he is not interested in form. He's a lover of film, and he cares about the formal choices that people make in order to capture a sense of realism. Arnheim, in the same way, is a formalist, but if you read him closely, he is deeply interested in the ways that the film image has this perceptual realism as one of his, main qualities. So the two positions are simplified in order to characterize these major approaches, but the theorists are always more interesting. And in a similar way, what I'm trying to say is kind of right in between, as you're noticing, between formalism and realism.
Okay. I would like to ask you something. When you're talking about realism and formalism, and now that we start to see motion pictures mixing humans with images, and humans filmed in a green. How do you see it? Because at this point of the technology, we are mixing two levels, and things get blurred, get quite confused.
Yeah, now, I'm glad you brought that up, and I think that's very relevant. So what I didn't talk about in this presentation, but what I talk about in the chapter, and I think this is relevant to the point that you're making, is that in my research, there's more of a tendency for critics, scholars to point out the amazingness of these particulate details in cartoons, less so in live action that uses CGI. So, and I think there's a simple explanation for it. When you watch a cartoon, like a Pixar cartoon, I don't mean a cell animated cartoon, but a kind of Pixar cartoon, they have this tendency to maintain the traditions of cartoony bodies. So you always know that you're watching a cartoon. Like the bodies have proportions that remind you of the traditions of Disney. Like they have big eyes, they have like soft round faces. They might have skin that resembles like the skin of human beings, but they never are mistaken for real human beings. However, there are always aspects of these films in the last 15 years where their environments will have like pure verisimilitude. So you'll have these cartoony bodies interacting in a snowy environment, but the snow looks incredibly real. Or you have like the Pixar film about dinosaurs, in which the dinosaurs are these cartoony rubbery things, but they're interacting in a photoreal natural environment where there's dirt and there's water and there's fire, and it all looks incredibly real. I think we need that tension in order to appreciate the real thing as a special effect, if that makes sense. Like, we need to be always reminded that we're watching a fabrication in order to notice when something incredibly real is the result of it being fabricated. When we don't notice that it's a fabrication, we tend to marvel at it a little bit less, right? So if you get really interested in the movie like Life of Pi, which some critics noticed that the water was really impressive, but if you get absorbed enough, you might forget that you are watching a person on a soundstage and all the water is CGI, right? But the cartoon always reminds you that it's the result of an achievement, of an image, because it's a cartoon, if that makes sense. Now, something like Avatar 2, which just came out, which is groundbreaking in its visual effects, I think is tough, because I think Avatar 2, we might call it live action because it has some human beings in it, but the way we watch it, we're always reminded of its fantasy element because it's consisting of these creatures that we know have perceptual qualities that look real, but we're never like mistaken in a way. And so when I watch the water in Avatar 2, I have this mesmerizing quality. At least that's my own experience.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I was listening to that and thinking about the trompe-l'oeil effect. It's like representation involves this idea of twofoldness, right? Volheim's twofoldness. You must be simultaneously aware that this is an articulation in the medium and that you see something in the medium. Because if when those two break down, you just have trompe-l'oeil and you lose. Volheim trompe-l'oeil is not a representation. So the medium, it always needs to call your attention to the fact that it is just a representation. And you can find this even in paradigms of realistic art. I mean, you have these two conflicting images, the painting as a window onto the world, but also the painting as something that contains the rules of its own fictional world that contain within it. In classical painting, in Renaissance painting, you will see clear signs that this is constructed. This is not just a window onto the world. So in a way, art always had that necessity of calling attention to the fact that this is reality, but seen through formal manipulation. This is what representation really is.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And it took me a while to realize how Arnheimian my ideas were. And I don't talk about Arnheim that much in the book, but actually, I was doing this lecture. I was like, oh, I just, presented Arnheim as just a way to make clear what Bazan's difference was. But in fact, a lot of what I'm doing is very close to Arnheim. I think that the twofoldness idea that your perception is always a twofold kind of thing. You can inhabit the idea that this is a reality, but you always see it as an image, and you never don't. And to call back the distinction between the cartoon and the live action CG spectacle, the Marvel film, you can experience those levels in different ways. So when we watch a Marvel film, it's not a trompe l'oeil. I know it's a film, but our relationship, say, to CG water might be a little framed version of this, right? The water in the cartoon is always going to feel as if it's created, a result of an aesthetic achievement, because every single aspect of the cartoon is reminding me that it's real. But spectators today don't marvel at the photographic reproduction of water. We just don't. And so when we watch a film in which we can believe that the water is photographed, and it's not, we need something to remind us that it's an achievement in order to be mesmerized by it. You know what I mean? So I feel like you can have different frames of the trompe l'oeil thing for different modes of attention. And since this particular presentation is interested in I'm not talking about expression or aesthetic achievement in the sense of what makes a film a great film. I'm just talking about an aesthetic appreciation of beauty or a kind of image. That can change based on our frames of reference for how an image was constructed, if that makes sense.
Yep. Well, thanks. Going back to the first question I was about to ask, when we were discussing indexicality, I was reminded of the paradox of horror. Noel Carroll talks a lot. Our instinctive reaction, or the typical horror film viewers instinctive reaction, you see the green slime on the screen, and then you shudder, or you have physical reaction. It is just a representation. It is an impossible representation. It doesn't represent anything real, and yet you react. That's part of the point of going to an horror film. So, and there you have a complete break with realism, and yet these reactions that were typical of indexicality, that people that we watch the train coming to the station in the film, and people run away. They are very similar. The reaction to the locomotive, the reaction to the green slime, the monster made of slime on the screen. So I'm not sure whether I can pull something out of this, but I was reminded of that discussion of the paradox of horror, which is already a break with indexicality and a break with realism. One of the ways of thinking about realism, there are many ways of characterizing realism, and one of them is informativeness, how informative a picture is. Here we can contrast. You can have representations which are more informative, non-realistic in the sense that they do not represent anything real, and yet they can be more informative than something that is an actual index of something real.
Right.
Well,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one supporting concept that I think is useful here, and I'm curious how you would think of how it diverges from the model of the paradox of horror, is the notion of Stephen Prince, film scholar, who has a notion of perceptual realism, which in a way is trying to solve in a simple way the paradox of the utterance, when I watch Jurassic Park, the dinosaurs are so real. So if I say I watched Jurassic Park and I say that dinosaurs are so real, you might say, how can you say the dinosaurs are real? You've never seen a dinosaur before. In fact, none of us has, right? So if you have a correspondence theory of reality or truth, you might respond to the person who says the dinosaurs look so real by saying, you don't know what you're talking about if you have no frame of reference for an actual dinosaur, like with flesh and muscle, then the dinosaurs can't look real. But of course, there's an intuitive truth to the claim that dinosaurs look real, and it's not because it's corresponding to the actual thing, it's corresponding to the sensory conventions of how things look in a real world with shading and volume and light value and that kind of thing. And of course, that's the thing that most CG artists are going for, because they're creating things that don't exist in the real world often, but their guide for creating that which never existed corresponds with basic conventions of how things tend to appear to our senses in a three-dimensional world with light and shadow, right? So that's at least one way to kind of get away from this idea that, oh my God, I'm watching something that was there and I'm amazed at that, right? Like, no, you're watching, like you have a more immediate impression, one might say, of something in front of your eyes. That's why I react to the slime, right? That's why I react to the dinosaurs. That's why I'm amazed at their fidelity to real world perception, even though I've never seen a dinosaur before. And so I think the index has kind of kept us down, but that's not to say that the index is not useful for certain kinds of aesthetic properties of cinema, because I do think it is. And I think Bazin is a wonderful theorist for talking about particular decisions that filmmakers make that take advantage of the world. One of my favorite moments from Bicycle Thieves is when, in the beginning of the film, the two characters are walking through the environment, and the director chooses to have the wife of the main character hold a heavy pail of water through this long scene. And she's not faking it. The actress is really holding a heavy pail of water, and she's struggling to carry it through the environment. So her struggle is actually real, because it's an index of an actor struggling to carry a pail of water, but it's also the character is equally struggling. Like, the difference between index and representation is actually fused perfectly. And I think that is a real aesthetic of realism. But I think it's actually deserves to be precisely applied to particular kinds of achievements within film. I think it's been over-applied, if that makes sense.
Hearing what you're saying, I was thinking about science fiction, and in particular, for instance, I'm remembering Interstellar, when there are a lot of images is in the end of the film when they simulate multiple dimensions, and right. It's interesting because in a way I think we tend to some films and other ones, the first ones, there are some images of Mars that we've never seen Mars, and it's difficult to imagine how it would be to land in Mars and put your foot in Mars. But the fact is that we have the impression we have already seen it.
Right. Right, exactly. Like, we have the impression that we've already seen it. And if we've never seen it before, a filmmaker has frames of reference based on other kinds of phenomena that they can compare it to, right? Like, just because we don't have a correspondence with an event that we want to produce in a film doesn't mean that we can't draw from other kinds of phenomena in order to produce the thing. I think that's really important.
About the realism, I was still yet thinking of a contrasting phenomenon, which is the so-called soap opera effect. Some people, me included, find it very dissatisfying to see a movie the same way you watch a football game, like with that extreme realist mode. Then you have to turn something off the settings of the television so you can see a grainy image again, and a grainy image again gives you a sense of reality. It's like the soap opera effect. deprives the movie of realism. I need a more grainy medium so that the movie looks convincing to me as a movie. Because
Right.
it's not like watching a soccer game, for instance.
Yeah, no, honestly, I'm personally very obsessed with this phenomenon of the soap opera effect for a number of reasons. And it sort of demonstrates beautifully the paradox of the paradoxes of realism, right? So you said that when the soap opera effect is on, which is just, a frame interpolation that simulates high frame rate on an image that doesn't have it. So if it's on your TV, it's basically making your image look like it's 60 frames per second or more. Which is standard for football games and video games, but not and also was standard with video of soap operas, right? But is not standard for cinema, 24 frames per second cinema. So when you watch it, interestingly, it's closer to how you perceive the real world, right? And in that sense, it might have more perceptual fidelity to the way our eyes, see the real world. But what we don't realize is that we have this frame of reference, this perceptual frame of reference for watching cinema, and cinema looks more real or correct or right or cinematic when it's in 24 frames per second. And if we see it in that slippery soap opera way, in a sense, it looks more like life and therefore looks less real as a convincing representation of a cinematic fiction, which is a very strange set of paradoxes if you follow what I'm saying. Like the football, like it works for football, and we don't even realize how we look at a football game differently than how we look at Indiana Jones, on TV. Like our mind has already made up the correct properties without us realizing it.
Yeah, and this reminds me of Goodman's arguments about realism, because it's supposed to be the most implausible part of Goodman's philosophy. And yet, there is a shred of evidence that having a frame of reference is what makes it more realistic.
Right. No, I think it makes perfect sense, right? Because it's the reference itself. It's the conventions are there. We don't freak out when we see the football game in 60 FPS or in high frame rate. We do freak out when we watch a good old-fashioned movie in high frame rate. And we might call that ease of watching, where we might call that realism in a sense.
Okay, you have been wonderful. I'm not going to put more weight on you, but I would like to end with it's more of a comment than or a suggestion than a question, because it was great for you to emphasize that passage from Kant in the Critique of Judgment about fire and water. It reminded me of this ancient passage in Plotinus' 6th treatise of the first Ennead about beauty, because he is refuting former theories of beauty that connected to ratios and proportions, like the golden sections and so forth. And he points out that we find beautiful things that cannot be parsed in terms of proportional relations of parts to each other, in numerical proportions. Like lightning, fire, or the glistening of gold or water. So exactly these phenomena. And this is something that runs through medieval aesthetics. We will always have this dual aspect of an aesthetics of order and number and proportion, and an aesthetics of light, which will coalesce in Aquinas' definition of beauty. You know what I mean? It's a twofold thing that runs through the history of aesthetics. And it seems like here to be emerging in Kant in a peculiar way, when he opposes the beautiful proper to the experience of these flickering images. That passage that you isolated from Kant actually raises a host of very problematic issues about Kant's own view of beauty, and I thank you for that. Also, it reminded me, moving more closely to film, that Tarkovsky's fascination with water and fire. Yep. I don't know, just might be complete contingent connection here. But I wonder whether any thoughts of these matters in the history of film theory could could somehow have played a role in his fascination for water and fire. But this is completely speculative. I have no idea.
Right. Well, I mean, just briefly, there's a tradition of the film history and film culture being interested in these things, right? Even when it's not explained what is the source of the interest in these things. And I do think there's a host of filmmakers who are associated with the elements. Tarkovsky is probably one of the biggest. A former colleague of mine actually has a book on Tarkovsky called like Tarkovsky and the Elements, Fire, Water, right? In which like that is the organizing principle for his book on Tarkovsky, is Tarkovsky's interest in fire and water and air and dirt. But Jean Epstein, who was a filmmaker in the teens, who is also considered one of the early classical, very poetic, impressionistic film theorists. I feel like Epstein, I have this deep kinship with Epstein as having an interest in the uniqueness of the image and its relationship to, say, water and wind and that kind of thing. And he employs it in his films. You can tell that he's interested in like the poetic movement of these things as they're captured in the images, and it's in his theory itself. So I feel like a good source for someone who made films, who employed aesthetic practices, but also theorized the medium that was very close to the way I'm thinking about the medium. I think it starts with Epstein, but it only continues through the history of film. And Tarkovsky might be one of the biggest names in cinema. I feel like for Tarkovsky, it has thematic value too, right? And so it would be hard for me, it would be limiting for me to apply what I'm thinking about to Tarkovsky's interest, which is not merely perceptual, but matters to the kind of the worlds that he creates and the kinds of like human meanings that he imports into his movies. So I don't want to limit them, but I do want to say that there is a tradition of being interested in these phenomena as being part of the history of film as a medium.
Thank you. There's nothing else. I will thank Jordan. You've been wonderful.
Thanks so much, guys. This has been really great. And Vitor, I'll ask you more about the Kant stuff and the Plotinus stuff.
Bye.
Bye-bye.